In 476 AD, the Roman Empire, once the most powerful civilization in the world, didn't fall overnight. In fact, its collapse was not just the result of barbarian invasions, economic mismanagement, or political chaos. It was a carefully orchestrated decline, a strategy that allowed its enemies and internal powers to dismantle it piece by piece. While the Roman citizens barely realized the full scale of the disaster until it was too late. Imagine a superpower today, the United States, unknowingly following the exact same blueprint, repeating the mistakes of history while the world watches in quiet disbelief. The story begins with a shocking truth. The Roman Empire had already been collapsing long before the last emperor was dethroned. The seeds were planted centuries earlier through debt, overextension, and the erosion of civic responsibility. Yet the public remained oblivious, dazzled by spectacles, distracted by propaganda, and lulled into a false sense of security. Sound familiar? Because if you look around America in 2026, you start noticing the same patterns emerging, patterns that history has already warned us about. Let's start with the economy. Rome, at its peak, controlled the known world, its wealth unmatched, its armies invincible. Yet beneath the grandeur of marble, aqueducts, and the Colosseum, economic cracks were forming. The empire relied heavily on conquest to fund its expansion, and once the pace of conquest slowed, the system began to strain. Heavy taxation, inflated currency, and reliance on slave labor created a fragile economic ecosystem. Similarly, America's economic structure today relies on continuous growth, ever-expanding credit markets, and the accumulation of massive national debt. In 2026, the U.S. debt has surpassed levels previously thought unimaginable. Interest payments consume enormous portions of federal revenue. And yet the public rarely grasps the long-term consequences. Just as Roman citizens continued their daily lives amidst rising taxes and currency devaluation, Americans go about their routines, swiping credit cards, mortgaging homes, and relying on financial systems that are, in many ways, built on borrowed time. The warning signs are there, yet society is distracted, often by entertainment, media cycles, or political theater, mirroring the distractions of ancient Rome. But economic decay is only part of the story. Social cohesion, or the lack thereof, played an equally critical role in Rome's downfall. Romans once prided themselves on civic duty, on loyalty to the state, on a shared sense of purpose. Over centuries, however, this sense of unity fractured. The ruling class became increasingly detached from the average citizen. Corruption infiltrated institutions, and the elite indulged in excess, while the masses became passive consumers of spectacle rather than active participants in governance. Fast forward to America today, and you see eerily similar trends. Polarization is at historic highs, public trust in institutions has eroded, and the media, once a tool for information, now often acts as a vehicle for distraction, sensationalism, and division. Citizens are divided not by shared goals, but by narratives carefully constructed to keep them busy, angry, or distracted. Rome collapsed not because the people didn't care. They were systematically manipulated, turning their energy away from critical civic engagement toward personal pleasure, survival, or entertainment. The parallels are unmistakable, and the lessons are clear. A society that loses its cohesion is vulnerable to both internal and external collapse. Military overreach was another Achilles heel for Rome. At its height, the Roman army stretched across thousands of miles, defending borders from Britain to the Middle East. Maintaining this vast territory required enormous resources, and as Rome's economy weakened, the strain became unsustainable. Rome increasingly relied on mercenaries, outsiders who had little loyalty to the empire, to defend its lands. Loyalty, discipline, and morale suffered. Leaving the empire exposed to external threats it could no longer repel. Today, America's military presence is global, costly, and in some areas, increasingly dependent on contractors and complex logistics, rather than the kind of domestic recruitment and civic support that once made a nation resilient. While the modern U.S. military is far more advanced than Rome's legions, the principle remains: overextension strains resources, erodes internal stability, and leaves even the most powerful nation vulnerable to both predictable and unexpected crises. History shows us that a superpower stretched too thin can fall victim not only to its enemies but to the consequences of its own overreach. Yet the most insidious element of Rome's collapse was subtle, almost invisible to the casual observer: the slow erosion of culture and values. Rome's citizens gradually lost the sense of shared purpose that had sustained the empire for centuries. Civic pride, moral responsibility, and the understanding that individual actions impacted the collective good gave way to hedonism, apathy, and short-term thinking. Wealth became a symbol of personal power rather than societal contribution, and the elite increasingly isolated themselves from the consequences of their actions. In modern America, one could argue the cultural shift is strikingly similar. Consumerism, individualism, and the pursuit of instant gratification dominate societal values. Civic engagement is declining. Critical thinking is often discouraged in favor of consensus-driven media narratives, and long-term planning is frequently sacrificed for short-term gains. Americans are comfortable in their routines, much like Romans who cheered in the Colosseum while their empire crumbled around them. The lesson here is brutal but necessary. A civilization can be technologically advanced, economically powerful, and militarily dominant, yet if its cultural foundation erodes, its decline is inevitable. Political instability accelerated Rome's decline. Leadership became a revolving door of short-term rulers, many more concerned with personal power than the welfare of the state. Civil wars erupted regularly, creating chaos, undermining trust, and depleting resources. Decisions were often made for survival, ambition, or profit rather than strategic long-term planning. Look at America today, and the signs are eerily familiar. The political environment is polarized, leadership changes are contentious, and policy decisions often prioritize political gain over long-term national interest. Citizens find themselves caught in cycles of outrage and distraction, focusing on personalities and conflicts rather than systemic problems. Just as Romans were preoccupied with palace intrigues while the empire's foundations crumbled. Political instability, combined with economic vulnerability and social fragmentation, creates the perfect storm for collapse, a storm that history suggests America may already be navigating. Rome's secret collapse strategy, if we can call it that, wasn't a strategy imposed from the outside. It was a set of internal vulnerabilities exploited over time: economic dependence on conquest, overextended military, cultural erosion, political instability, and social fragmentation. External enemies didn't need to strike suddenly or decisively. They waited, watched, and moved when the time was right. They understood that an empire divided from within is far easier to conquer than one united by purpose and values. For America, the lesson is haunting. External threats may be less significant than internal decay. A superpower is only as strong as its economy, its social cohesion, its culture, and its political stability. When any of these pillars weaken, the consequences can unfold rapidly, often before the general public fully comprehends the gravity of the situation. History also teaches a lesson about awareness and inertia. Romans were aware of certain issues: economic strain, political corruption, military challenges, yet they failed to respond adequately. Reforms were attempted, sometimes partially successful, but systemic inertia prevented meaningful change. Citizens, distracted by daily life and state propaganda, often accepted small concessions that cumulatively undermined their long-term security. In modern America, one could argue a similar inertia exists. Citizens are aware of mounting debt, social division, and political dysfunction, yet meaningful systemic reforms remain elusive. Entertainment, social media, consumerism, and the speed of modern life create a society distracted, with attention constantly redirected away from long-term strategic thinking. The Roman lesson is clear: awareness without action can be as dangerous as ignorance. Even Rome's education and information systems contributed to its decline. Knowledge and civic responsibility were concentrated among a small elite, while the general populace received information tailored to maintain compliance, distract, or pacify. Critical thought and questioning were often discouraged. And over time, citizens became accustomed to consuming information rather than analyzing it. America faces a modern version of this challenge. Media, algorithms, and information silos create echo chambers, encouraging people to accept narratives rather than critically evaluate them. The collapse of an empire is never instantaneous. It begins with the subtle weakening of minds and values. When citizens stop questioning, when they become passive participants in a system they barely understand, the structure becomes increasingly fragile, no matter how impressive it appears from the outside. Another factor that sealed Rome's fate was debt and financial dependency. Rome increasingly borrowed to sustain its lifestyle, fund military campaigns, and placate its populace. Inflation, devaluation of currency, and unequal wealth distribution followed, creating resentment, instability, and vulnerability. Today, America's national debt and financial system operate under similar pressures. Reliance on borrowed money to maintain the economy, coupled with growing wealth inequality and consumer debt, mirrors Rome's financial fragility. History shows that unchecked debt and financial mismanagement, left uncorrected, can rapidly erode the foundation of even the most powerful empire. Perhaps the most chilling similarity between Rome and America lies in the idea of delayed consequences. In Rome, the effects of poor decisions often appeared decades after the policies were enacted. Citizens saw immediate benefits, gains, infrastructure, temporary economic gains, without perceiving the long-term consequences. Modern America faces a similar trap. Decisions around fiscal policy, foreign engagement, cultural shifts, and technological reliance create immediate advantages or conveniences, but often carry hidden long-term risks. The public may not feel the impact until critical systems are strained, crises erupt, or social trust collapses. Just like Romans cheering in the Colosseum, Americans may be distracted by short-term gains, oblivious to the slow-moving disaster forming in the background. The collapse of Rome also reveals the importance of leadership vision. Successful leaders recognize the value of reform, long-term planning, and civic responsibility. Yet these efforts were frequently undermined by entrenched interests, personal ambition, or systemic inertia. America today faces a leadership challenge of similar magnitude. Even well-intentioned leaders often struggle against polarized politics, institutional resistance, and short-term public pressure. Without leaders capable of thinking decades ahead, addressing systemic weaknesses, and inspiring a sense of collective purpose, the risk of repeating history becomes alarmingly real. Finally, the overarching lesson is that collapse rarely feels inevitable until it is immediate. Rome's citizens did not wake up one morning to find the empire gone. The fall was gradual, a series of small, compounding failures that left them vulnerable to final external blows. America, in 2026, faces a moment where history could be repeating itself. Economic strain, social fragmentation, political dysfunction, cultural erosion, and overextension create vulnerabilities that may seem abstract or distant to many. Yet they are strikingly real when viewed through the lens of history. The question is not if lessons exist. They do in every nuance of Roman decline, but whether society will recognize them, act decisively, and avoid the same fate. Understanding Rome's secret collapse strategy is not about fear-mongering. It is about awareness, preparation, and the ability to draw insights from history. Rome fell because it allowed small cracks to grow, because it mismanaged its resources, fragmented its culture, and delayed reform until it was too late. America stands at a crossroads where similar vulnerabilities exist. Debt, division, overreach, distraction, and systemic inertia are the warning signs. The same signs that once foreshadowed the end of an empire. Citizens, leaders, and institutions have a choice. Ignore history and allow the cracks to widen. Or confront these challenges head-on with strategic foresight, civic engagement, and long-term planning. In the end, the story of Rome is not just a story of conquest and collapse. It is a cautionary tale about human nature, societal priorities, and the fragility of power. Superpowers are not immortal. Wealth, technology, and military might cannot compensate for cultural decay, political instability, and economic fragility. America in 2026 may not be doomed, but it is undeniably walking a path that history has already charted. Recognizing the parallels is the first step. Understanding the mechanisms of decline, debt, overextension, division, distraction, and erosion of values is the second. And taking deliberate action to fortify society, reform systems, and restore civic responsibility may be the final step that determines whether history repeats itself or is rewritten. Because one thing is certain, the fall of Rome was not a sudden event. It was a process. And processes, unlike disasters, can be understood, predicted, and perhaps even prevented.